Yuma Malandi is hello and welcome in Ngunnawal, and Yama is Gomeroi in saying hello. I'm Micheal, I'm Ngunnawal Gomeroi, and I'm the Indigenous Liaison Officer at Strait Memorial. Thank you for coming. Before I start, I just want to get a bit of an idea of some of the base information that you may have. Would anybody know why I've called my speech Serving Under the Protector? Anybody? Not you, Sandra. Yeah, it's an interesting one, because what I'm going to do today is talk about the conditions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men had to enlist in at the time of the conflicts I'm referring to. But interestingly enough, I'm going to delve a little bit further back than that. But the Protector is a reference to the Protector of Aborigines, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail about the inequities of society at the time of the First and Second World War, and indeed Korea, and indeed Malaya, and indeed Borneo, and indeed the start of the Vietnam War. So I'm going to just go through that, looking at the social, political history and policies that governed the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia, but I'm going to have that juxtaposition as that yet we served. Okay? So if you get upset with that, I'm sorry, but the truth hurts. So I do an acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. Pay my respects to the Wiradjuri people. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and also recognise their ongoing custodianships of the land. I would also like to acknowledge any other Aboriginal elders and elders from the Torres Strait Islander community, and also importantly the heritages of all the attendees today. I further acknowledge those that have served, those that are still serving, and the loved ones that have supported this service. And as I said, Yuma is Ngunnawal and Yama is Gomeroi. I would like to acknowledge Dubbo Regional Council, and in particular Simone Taylor, for all of her work, and indeed for all of you for this invitation. And I thank you for this proactive approach to reconciliation through education with sincerity. In acknowledging that we gather on the traditional lands of the Wiradjuri, you are paying respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, histories and custodianships of traditional lands and islands throughout Australia. It's an important start to any content, because we're going back, and we'll see the importance of that as we move through history. There's a cultural advisory that we put up, because the bottom part, although you can understand that the First World War men that are represented here have passed away, there are the images of deceased people in my talk, but it's the terms that I use, and I'm going to use terms that are historically correct. I'm not going to whitewash history. But it was terms that were utilised and under the control when our men and women were trying to enlist and serve and defend the nation. I put this one up to get everybody in the mindset of where we're going to. You know, we've all read those ones, and some of my favourites here. My bottom one is the favourite. They don't even bother trying to learn our language. Now, we've all heard that before, haven't we? Yeah. Been to the barbecue, heard it at the pub, listened to talkback radio, so. But this is what I like to do with that. Everyone's got that in their mind, haven't they? Think about it now. They don't even bother to learn the language. Don't understand the culture, don't understand the people. But that's now flipped that 180 degrees. It's about Australia together, the traditional custodians, and the impact of colonisation. But our men still willing to serve and enlist and defend, and in some cases pay the ultimate sacrifice. This image reflects, to me, the two aspects we're talking about. Equality in the service and the inequality in the social aspect of Australia through the period. And in the beginning, when you look at that, that's the Australia BC. That's before Cook. So that's how the map would have looked way back when. So we had this vast continent with all the resources, all of the management, all of the benefits that were picked up by the claiming of sovereignty of this land by the Regina. This is an interesting one for the history buffs. Anyone know who that is? Yep.
South America.
Kicking bull?
Sitting.
Sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Yep.
Sitting bull? Yeah, it's correct. Anybody else know that? Did anybody else know that? Interesting, yeah? Good. This is really good. I like this because... But did anybody know his name was Otawake?
No.
That's his real name. But everybody knows Sitting Bull. And that's the reflections of the impact of colonisation. Interesting that, isn't it, when you start thinking about decolonising your thoughts. Another one? Anyone, who's that? Geronimo? Everyone heard of that, haven't we?
Yeah.
Did we know his name was Gyoto?
No.
Sister down the front did. But again, interesting one, that one. But this is where we get a little bit more depth. Anyone know who that is? Who? Pemulwuy. That's Pemulwuy of the Bidjigal people. He was the leader of the resistance at Sydney Cove and fought the Sydney Wars for about 25 years. But only one person sort of recognised him. But a lot of people knew the American Indian, the leaders of the resistance of the Native Americans. That's the truth that we need to get through. It's our history, it's Australian history, and we don't know the leaders of our resistance or the impact of the colonisation on our people. Anyone know who that is?
Beanlog?
No. Ngunnawal. Another one, Ngunnawal. And he again led a campaign of resistance in and around Bathurst and for the Wiradjuri people as the second major campaign in the frontier wars. And again, only one person sort of knew his name, and it took 2 or 3 guesses. But I'm glad to see that you knew some historical names of our men and women who were featured in the Australian history, and it's very coloured, that depiction. So that's what we're looking at here, is thinking about how do we talk about this part of our history that makes it comfortable. Because we don't look at it as Aboriginal history, we look at it as Australian history. And the more we incorporate the truth about the impacts of the colonisation, the more we can move together and move forward. Who's that man?
Saunders, Secretary.
Yep. Very, very quick one, that one. That was, the veterans know him because he's really well respected. If you Google search Aboriginal Service, Aboriginal Soldier, his name and image is going to pop up first. But I've included Uncle Reg there for a different reason. Have a close look at the photo. What's the photo telling you?
That he's the sergeant.
He's the sergeant.
He's the only Aboriginal man there?
He's the only Aboriginal man there.
I feel like he seems equal there.
Exactly. He's unified. They're enjoying each other's company. In the service and in the uniform, he's accepted. He's a leader and he's still accepted. But that photo is talking about that, and it's the anticipation of going to war. That's pre-embarkation in the Second World War. Now, Uncle Reg Saunders is bestowed the honour of being the first identified Aboriginal man to be commissioned as an officer. That's his claim to fame. And that's his story there. The first commissioned officer, Reginald Walter Saunders, in 1944. He comes out as a second lieutenant at the end of the Second World War, but he later comes back and enlists in the Korean War, and he's a captain and led men in battle at the Battle of Kapyong. So the great leader, and the acknowledgement that despite what happens to him and the policies that we'll get to down the track, he was accepted within the military as being just a good soldier. Nobody cared about the colour of his skin. He was just a good soldier. And you could hear that in my friend at the back there immediately knew who he was, his division, and that he's just a good soldier. And that's how we have to look about the enlistments and recruitment of our men. Once you're in, you're in. But the story for another reason. Because he has this quote. And this quote reads, and this is what he said in December 1944. He also said, "Australia is my country. I never fought for anybody but Australia. I always was loyal to my country. I fought for the Queen of Australia or the King of Australia. I didn't want the King or Queen of England because I'd just have been as happy fighting against them. Australia is my country. I don't owe any allegiance or loyalty to the Queen of England. They tried to bloody destroy me, my family, my tribe, my people. I love my country very much and I like the people in Australia, so my loyalty was purely Australian. We were the first defenders of Australia. The English never defended Australia at all. We did, and we suffered very badly for that. Decimated to hell." Now that's Uncle Reg Saunders saying that in an interview in 1944. But he's not referring to standard conflict for Australia. He's referring to his great-grandfather's fighting in the Gomeroi Wars and the Ngunnawal people and the defence around Portland in Victoria, where the first impact of colonisation came after the end of the Black Wars in Tasmania. The colonies sailed back across the Strait to Tasmanian land on Portland. So this is another 30-year campaign of the Ngunnawal to defend their countries and resist colonisation. And Uncle Reg is referring to that, decimated to hell. He's talking about the impact, but yet he put Australia on his uniform. And he fought with dignity and respect and had the opportunity to rise in the ranks. So there's two different positions there that we're talking about. It's represented in the same family line, but still wants to defend the country. So when you look at the whole history of the soldier, we need to understand that. But Reg is very well respected. Uncle Reg is very well respected. And this is the Frontier Wars, greater depiction of the Frontier Wars. I put these three images up to reflect three different time periods. And I say the Frontier Wars on the top of this, because you can see in the top left, that's clearly the Frontier Wars as we would imagine it in our mind. Aboriginal warriors attacking a camp of non-Indigenous settlers, farmers, graziers. But then I put these boys in, and they're the Torres Strait Light Infantry Battalion. I'll talk more about those later. And I put this photo in. This is the NTRSU, the Northern Territory Special Reconnaissance Unit. These are the men that signify the change from warrior to soldier in one day. In 1936, they were jailed for defending their country against Japanese sailors who came down, and the retribution was that they speared the Japanese sailors. 6 of the men were locked up and sent to Tony Bay Jail after a lot of interactions from the Crown and the Federal Court in and around Callan Bay. But in 1942, after the work of Ngunnawal, he unified the Arnhem Land tribes with the Makarrata, and they decided to fight one common enemy, which is the Japanese. 6 of these men were released from jail for killing Japanese and enlisted to go kill Japanese. They become Australian soldiers and put down their traditional weapons to fight against the colony, to fight against the Japanese. But as you can see, they're on parade with their traditional weapons and in their traditional clothing, because they were going to be a tactic to, if Japan invaded, they were going to disrupt the supply lines as a guerrilla warfare. And they thought the Japanese won't kill a man with a spear, but they'll kill him if he's got a rifle. And they were going to disrupt the lines. That was the thinking. The incorporation and utilisation of the skills and abilities of men on their traditional country was an accepted practice. And it reflects in the NTRSU. They later become the Nakaroos, because the politicians have decided we better not be teaching them blackfellas how to fight properly, because they're going to rise up against us. So they disbanded this, and then they supported the Nakaroos later on by helping them with the knowledge of the traditional lands and countries. There's just an indication of some of the other battles and wars and campaigns of resistance that go on around Australia. This is limited because we're telling a broader, deeper recognition of the frontier wars of the Australian War Memorial in 2028 when we open the new galleries. But these are just a few of the examples that we'll be looking at, the campaigns of resistance. So, just talking about defence of country, we're looking way back, from 1770 all the way through to about 1936. 140 odd years of military history that we have to tell. But to get into the army, the AIF, our earliest known men in the 1800s, these are the restrictions that we place. And you can't obviously see this restriction, but it's the social representation and depiction of our men and women who are going to fight. Douglas Grant, he's got the dignity of being an Aboriginal soldier. But Harold West and George Leonard, talking about Abbo's revenge, Abbo's vengeance. He's in the negative. He's boiled down. He's not talking about a brave soldier who ran a 3-week campaign of guerrilla warfare against the Japanese on Kokoda. It's an Abbo's vengeance. He'd come back to camp, get a haversack of hand grenades and go back out by himself to avenge the death of his good mate, George Leonard. And over here we're talking about cheers for Abbo rights. That article, the RSL, cheered on a move to obtain full citizenship rights for Aboriginals turned servicemen. But the headline is, cheers for Abbos. We're in the negative. We're less than. And down here, an Abbo with the IOF in Egypt aroused the Arabs' interest. We're a mascot. We're an oddity. We're not a soldier over there fighting for Australia with a man of colour. The press are writing about him as being an oddity. Isn't it amusing to have a black fella? Now that's the first restriction. It's in the mind being projected by the political state of the day and also the media reinforcing that. But our men are enlisting and going to do these jobs and fighting with their brothers equally on Kokoda and on Gallipoli. And then the Defence Act 1903, amended 1909, Section 61, persons exempt, and that's persons who are not substantially of European origin or descent, of which the medical authorities appointed under the regulation shall be the judges. It was a white man's war for white men, and people of colour were exempt. Not only Aboriginal men were exempt, that's also our Asiatic brothers and sisters, and other nations from the Afro-Caribbean nations, because they didn't want to be white men to be mixing with men of colour. Now that's the second restriction imposed on us. And Richard Martin, this is where we talk about Richard Martin, and unfortunately Uncle Richard is a Quandamooka man. Anyone know what Quandamooka is? It's Stradbroke Island. Just off Brisbane, little island, Queensland. Richard Martin enlists in December 1914. He unfortunately pays the ultimate sacrifice. But what he knows about this is his attestation. Uncle Richard Martin, Aboriginal man from Quandamooka, changes his heritage. Says that he's born in the town of Dunedin in New Zealand, and he claims to be a Maori to get in, but he didn't want to get rejected because of the colour of his skin. We have 22 Aboriginal men who do the same. They call themselves Maori. Anybody understand why they'd say they were Maori? Nobody? No? Because under the Treaty of Waitangi, Maoris were considered to be Commonwealth citizens, British subjects. And as you can see here, are you a natural born British subject or a naturalised British subject? And he says yes. Interesting piece of documentation. You're not wanted in the service, but he changes his heritage to get in. Under the Act, 1903 Defence Act, this is the power of that Act. And this is an attestation in 1941 of an Aboriginal man, Jeffrey Barnes. Dear Sir, I have the pleasure in advising that the Aborigines Protection Board has given consent for Reginald Jeffrey Barnes to enlist in the Royal Australian Air Force. The board has also agreed to exempt him unconditionally from the provision of the Aborigines Act 34 to 39. Mr Barnes is now regarded in law as a white man, and I have no doubt that he will uphold the high traditions of the RAAF. Jeffrey becomes a white man because it was gifted to him by the protector of Aborigines. But what people miss in that is that Jeffrey had to go to the Border Protection for approval, consent to enlist, because that power had been removed from his parents. The manager of the Aborigines Protection Board, the secretary, had to give him permission to enlist because it had been removed from his parents. That's why, and then while they're there, we'll make you a white man. And that's in 1941, in the Second World War, but yet Jeffrey wants to enlist. These are the general listing instructions for officers. This is what it boils down to. You've got a booklet for the recruiting sergeants, men of not substantial European origin, all descent are not to be enlisted. Doubtful cases should be referred to the medical officer. Do apologise for the blurriness of that slide, but it just gets too big if I put the high-res images in. And so that's what we're trying to fight against, our men, changing their heritage, and to get around that. But the doubtful cases be referred to the medical officer, give us wiggle room. And that's how a lot of our men get in. Until March 1917. This is a wonderful little piece of history. Military Order 200, or commonly referred to as the half-caste rule. There you go, March 1917 comes in. Half-castes may be enlisted into the Australian Imperial Forces, provided that the examining medical officers are satisfied that one of the parents is of European origin. Note, all previous instructions on this subject are cancelled. But anybody understand what was happening in Australia at the time, 1917, and also on the Western Front?
Running out of reinforcements.
They weren't meeting their recruitment targets. And what had happened at home at the time?
Conscription.
Conscription had been defeated. The 2 referendum on conscription had been defeated. We weren't meeting our targets, so the military said, we're sick of rejecting fit, able-bodied young men for the colour of their skin. So whether it's a need for resources or an understanding that Aboriginal men are just as good and equal soldiers, we don't know. But I think it's going to be the resources issue, because we weren't meeting our targets that we'd said we would to the Commonwealth. Now that's an interesting move, that one, because of the wording, and it also gives it our wiggle room. At the moment, when I publish my lists again, there are going to be just over 1,200 enlistments or attempts to enlist by Aboriginal men. The lesser number of 867 saw active service overseas. That's just a smidge under a battalion size, which is a pretty good commitment from Aboriginal people when you weren't allowed to get in, and the size of our population at the time. Our rates of enlistment are equal to their non-Indigenous brothers and sisters, despite the restrictions that we've outlined. This is the third restriction on our people, and this is why I call it serving under the protector. And this is the Aborigines Protection Act of 1909. Anyone heard of this? This is the state legislation and rules that govern the management of Aboriginal people in New South Wales. This was enacted in 1909 into legislation, although the practice had been going on since about 1869, 1870. It was formalised in 1909 after Federation. But what I get you to have a look at is that the Act is to provide for the protection and care of Aborigines. What a wonderful statement. But is to repeal the Supply of Liquor to Aborigines Prevention Act, and is to amend the Vagrancy Act and the Police Offences Amendment Act, and for the purposes consequent to this. So what's that actually saying on the ground? That's saying that Aboriginal people are drunks, vagrants and petty criminals. And the protector needs the powers to manage and control those people with those parts of the Act. So that's the thought that's going into the protection of Aborigines at the time. And this is 1909, and we go to war in 1914, and yet our men are serving. But that Act does more than that. Sorry about the blurriness again. This is the duty of the board. And there's some interesting ones in there, but my one is C. To provide for the custody, maintenance and education of the children of Aborigines. Anybody hazard a guess to what that actually means?
Probably allows the kids to be taken away.
That's the power of the stolen generations in Act. Because after 1909, every Aboriginal child born in New South Wales is born into the custody of the protector of Aborigines. And he can do whatever he wants with our children, such as to give consent to enlist or be removed or taken away. Or the assigning assimilation policies where lighter-skinned Aboriginal children were removed to Christianise and civilise them. But yet our men are serving. This Act brings in segregation, restricts our movements, restricts our ability to earn a wage, to own property. This is the Act that controls Aboriginal people in New South Wales, but not only in New South Wales, nationally. An interesting one here, that's the Acts that go across. An interesting one is 1905, the Aborigines Protection Act, the Aborigines Act 1905. Has everybody seen or anybody seen Rabbit-Proof Fence?
Yes.
Yes.
There's some interesting scenes in there, and I'd hope to encourage you to go home and have a re-look at the movie. It's about stolen generations and the three girls working their way back home. But in the background to that movie, you'll see A.O. Neville, the protector of Aborigines in Western Australia, always meeting with 2 or 3 other men in suits. Now, those men in suits, when you listen to them, they only say 4 or 5 sentences have South African accents. Because they're here to investigate the utilisation of the Aborigines Act in Western Australia. They export it and it rebranded apartheid. And now everybody's familiar with apartheid, but did you know it was born out of the Aborigines Protection Act in Western Australia? Our people were living under these conditions, but protesting it against the implications of that in another country, but quietly pushing our people to the sides of society. That's why missions are on the edge of towns, because we weren't allowed in town under these restrictions. The Aborigines Protection Act in Western Australia is the genesis of apartheid under the legislation and policies. Now I'll just go back. And an interesting one here. No legislation following the displacement of First Nations people in 1830 in Tasmania. No need for a Protections Act if there are no Aborigines left. That's the thinking. Truganini passes, and we all know that she's not the last Aboriginal Tasmanian by a long, long way. But as a result of the Black Line and the Black Wars and the resistors and the Palawa leadership agreeing to put down their weapons and got moved out to the islands, they decide there are no more Aboriginal people anymore in Tasmania, so they don't need an act. It's nice of them, isn't it? And now this is another restriction imposed on our people, and this is our constitution. And section 127, in the reckoning of numbers of the people of the Commonwealth or the state or other part of the Commonwealth, Aboriginal natives shall not be counted. That's in the Constitution, and it was in there up until when?
67.
67. And what did the 1967 referendum allow us happen for Aboriginal people? What did it allow us to do?
To be counted on the census.
Be counted. And once we exist and we're counted in the census, the federal government can then make national policy on Aboriginal people and therefore remove the need for the protected in the various states. So that's the power of the 67 referendum. This is a doozy as well. The Parliament shall, subject to the Constitution, have powers to make laws for the peace, order and good government of the Commonwealth in respect to number 16, the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state, for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws, which we've seen the special laws. The Constitution of Australia specifically prohibited the recognition of Aboriginal people. In the two references to Aboriginal people in the Constitution, prior to 1967, specifically deny the recognition of Aboriginal people. Anybody know why? No, close. It is a two-word answer, but it's not terra nullius.
Because they're classed as fauna and flora.
No,
States' rights.
no. Close though. It's property rights. If we exist legally, we own the land, they've got to pay us back. We don't exist legally, terra nullius exists, and therefore they don't have to pay us. That's why they've written it. It's written by lawyers for lawyers in Britain, our Constitution. Unfortunately, that's still in there. But why would you want to serve? And here's a great story of Charles Manager, Torres Strait Islander serviceman. Gives an interview in after on a break from the Second World War, and he said, "Why do you want to serve?" And Charles Manager says this: "I want to come back to an Australia where my people will have full rights as citizens, to an Australia where Aboriginal children will have the right to education, to work and to a healthy, happy life." That was an interview that he gave in 1944. So that was still in place. Charles Manager goes on to have a 30-year career in the military, fights in the Second World War, goes to Korea, he wins a military medal in Korea, and it's bestowed on him in Malaya. But that's why he's fighting, for the rights of children to have a free and better society. Luckily enough, we've got Uncle Charles' words, and that's him receiving, obviously, as a much older man. And they say, "Why did you volunteer?" And he writes, "To fight for country, my family, my mother, my fathers, my brothers, my sisters." That's why a man would go and fight. And he says it, he tells me. I can't, and don't want to say I speak for veterans, because I can't. I've never put the uniform on. But I can only reflect the views that I know. And that's Uncle Charles Manager telling me that. But he wanted to do it, he thought that was a path. And once he was in, he was equal. And wins the Bravery Award. William Wallace Chatfield, the lovely photo. Interesting photo this, because it speaks to a lot of different things. When you look at the photo, what do you first think? What's unusual about the photo?
Wedding.
Pardon?
A wedding.
It's a wedding photo. Right. This is the hero here, William Wallace Chatfield, and the beautiful bride, Mary Jane Kane. The wedding takes place at Burrabadee Mission, the Cooter Barrabin, and he has his two groomsmen are soldiers. But interestingly enough, when you look at William Wallace's discharge papers, there's some things I'll point out. This is on the 15th of March 1918. So it's a year after the half-caste rule. And the board has examined William Wallace and finds that he is unfit for active service, unsuitable for physique, colour. That man, physique, was unsuitable. But those of us in the room that are smart think, there's something incongruent with that, isn't there? Why is that? I'll give you a hint. The wedding happened in 1920. So why don't those two things match up? Was discharged, unfit, 1918. But he's in uniform with a return from active service badge on. How can that be? No, he didn't give up. He got rejected in Cessnock, got on the train, went back to Coonabarabran and got accepted. The military told him he was too dark, but he didn't give up. And then it speaks to, I don't know about the gentleman in this room, but I was made sure that I had my best set of clothes on when I got married. And he chooses to wear a uniform. And his beautiful bride is also in her best. So that's the power of that. He's choosing to show that he's served. He's choosing to use the Australian uniform as his best set of clothes, and he's marrying his bride after the country told him he was too dark. That's a powerful message. I know this for sure, because they're my great-grandparents. And just in case, colour, just to ensure that he's not a little bit sick that day, he might have had a bit of an illness. This is the Hilliard brothers in Victoria, George and William Hilliard, and the board finds them unfit, unsuitable physique, Aboriginal. Unsuitable physique, Aboriginal. They were rejected because they're Aboriginal. And it's not a one-off. Of the 1,200 enlistments in the First World War, 287 men got rejected. 95% of them are because of race. And there are examples. Physique too low for military service, and Aboriginal, almost full-blood. Half-caste Aboriginal, too near full-blood. Aboriginal, full-blood. Half-caste Aboriginal, too full-blooded for the AIF. Fit young men being rejected because of the colour of their skin. And that's the First World War. It didn't change in the Second World War because we've got the complexions coloured. His distinctive marks, Aboriginal, mole on back. Point Pierce mission. His wife, his identification, his hair's black, his eyes are brown, distinctive marks, Aboriginal. So it's complexion, half caste. Eyes, either dark, half caste.
What are the dates on that?
They range in the Second World War from 40 to 45. And where does your family sit? This is an interesting table that I put up. But if you look, this is the rights of Aboriginal people across Australia in 1963. And what I find people do, they go to this and they have a look and go to the state that they were born in and they go, "You beauty, it's great to be a blackfella in New South Wales." And not so much in Queensland, or not so much in the Northern Territory, or not so much in Western Australia. But when you do that, you think about how, and I don't want to be, I'm going to judge this, and I do apologise if I offend anyone. Some people in this room might have been born when this table was around. I'm not sure, but they might be. It's borderline. So this is in lived memory. But then when I say, okay, that's great to be a New South Wales Aboriginal fella, but look at the list. It's voting rights, to marry freely, interracial marriage and permission to marry an Aboriginal woman had to be sought, to control your own children, Anybody in the room imagine not being able to control your own children? Not the control you're thinking of, because no one can do that. But having the government tell you how to manage your children. To move freely. To move freely is the implication of segregation and to be restricted to missions and reserves. That's in 1963. To own property, to receive award wages and to be allowed alcohol. That was put together in 1963 so people could use that to go around and tell the conditions of Aboriginal people in preparation for the 1967 referendum. That was the utilisation of awareness, a tool to raise the awareness of the current treatment in 63 in preparation for the 67 referendum. And in 51, we're still in Korea. We're going to Malaya. And when the Vietnam commitment starts, and when national service comes in, it's still an exemption to be Aboriginal from the national service call-up. But yet our men served equally and with respect and treated, not 100%, but fairly high numbers of acceptance in the military. There are some cases of racism. I live in a real world. But mostly, if you're a good soldier, you're a good soldier. But our men served, fighting for rights that we weren't entitled to. And interestingly, I talk about this, is that you hear today, especially on ANZAC Day, they were fighting for their freedom. We didn't have freedom. As a race, we were controlled. We were segregated. And yet our men enlisted to serve. And women, 67 Aboriginal women in the Second World War. We have at the moment, if you have any Aboriginal family members here, shake your tree, I want to find some more women. And this is some numbers that were put together. We have 11 men in the Boer War. We're estimating 7,500 in the Second World War. Now that's men with a hat and a gun and a service number. The next number is the ancillary recruitment force that we utilised. Because after the bombing of Darwin and when the war fell on the Northern Territory and the top end, the war landed on our communities. Because the Army built air bases and radar stations and roads where there was permanent water. And what's the weed near permanent water? Aboriginal settlements. So the utilisation of our skills and our ability. The work on the stations in the Northern Territory became a restricted industry. Our men on the stations couldn't enlist because they had to stay to produce the meat to feed the Americans. Our men that were working on the docks couldn't leave and enlist because they had to move the goods to the ships to get to the supplies. Protected industries. They're still defence of country because you're still providing duty and making the war effort work. Because although the pointy end is the men with the guns and the hats in the trenches, the back end to support that is most often neglected. And the supply chain. And we go down those lists. We've got service and sacrifice and also our peacekeepers. The Torres Strait Island Light Infantry Battalion, this is the only blight on the military ADF, IIF history, where they used segregation and they used unequal pay. All other Aboriginal men in Australia in the services were paid equally, except the Torres Strait Island Light Infantry Battalion, because our good friends in Queensland decided because they were at home they only needed a third of the pay. The Torres Strait Islander boys didn't like that and went on strike, becoming the first battalion in AIF history to ever go on strike. The Japanese bombed Horn Island a week later and they said, run over to the tent and said, come on boys, we need you, you've got to come and help us. we'll give you 2/3 of the pay. And they said, we don't like that, but we're coming to fight. Therefore, being the only battalion in AOF history to win a strike. But thankfully for us, that goes on to be a monumental decision on behalf of the Queensland and Department of Defence. Because in 1994, they decided to fix that up. So they got all the records and they indexed and repaid the men the rates of money that they were owed to full pay of a soldier. That became the legal precedence for the stolen wages cases, or the stolen wages of Aboriginal people across Australia. It became legal precedent to pay people what they were owed. And that's now rolling out into billions of dollars worth of pay. Just on a side note, you know, the Aboriginal Protector of New South Wales finished off the payment of the Harbour Bridge. The state government went broke, so they dipped into the Protector's money. The black fellas paid for the Harbour Bridge, so I want my 2 lanes back. Toll free for black fellas on the Harbour Bridge. Just a side note. But what's really interesting about these guys is that it was 836 volunteered, just again a smidge under a full battalion unit, but they were created to be a battalion. Torres Strait Island Battalion represented 95% enlistment rate, which is the largest community rate of participation in the world without conscription. The standard rate of volunteerism in Australia in the Second World War was 23%, and the Torres Strait hit 95%. And the 5% who didn't get in were too young, too old, or medically unfit. It would have been 100, but they got knocked back. That's a marvellous effort, 95% volunteerism, and they volunteered. A special platoon is another part of utilisation, not so much segregation, but the willingness to send Aboriginal men to war. 41 men from Lake Tyers Mission in Victoria, New South Wales, Victoria, enlisted in June and July 1940. They go to the training camp at Rangarata, and they're training there for 3 months, and the Commandant writes to the headquarters and says, can you tell me what am I going to do with all these Aboriginal and half-castes? And the letter comes back from the Army HQ, the recruitment and enlistment of Aboriginal men is neither required nor desired. And they were to be sent home. However, the media department came up with a campaign. You want to utilise these guys in publicity. And has anybody seen the City Sound reels with the Aboriginal men at training? It's called the King's Own. It's probably the most racist commentary you'll ever hear in moving pictures in Australia, but that's those guys. And it came out before movies leading up to recruitment. Because what they wanted to do is have non-Indigenous women be outraged that if a black man's got to go and defend me, we're lost. Every time it filmed, non-Indigenous recruitment went up because non-Indigenous women wrote to the papers and complained, I'm not safe. Unfortunately, these guys, and the Commandant worked with them, he said, boys, I understand we can't send you to the war, but we want you to do this other role. And they said, no, if we can't fight, we're going home. And they got honourably discharged. But put their hand up to go and fight, weren't allowed to. That's of course in 1940. Different case in 1942 after the Japanese arrived. If you could hold the shirt up, you're in. Everybody got really scared when the Japanese knocked on our front door. This is some indications of our men in the Boer War. In Beikoff, in Korea, in Vietnam, the NTRSU, the Snake Bay Patrol. This is a great example. I put this up all the time. Look at the dignity in them men. They're on parade, they're in uniform, they have weapons, they're being inspected. Not one of these men have a service number. Not one of these men got paid. It wasn't until 1984 when the Northern Territory government put in special legislation to name these men as soldiers that they were entitled to veterans' rights and services. They were deemed to be performing the duties of a soldier and therefore were entitled to that. None of these men have service numbers. So So we don't have a history or record of them, except in the photos and what they did. That's the Snake Bay Patrol, the Tiwi people from Melville and Bathurst Islands. That war fell on them, but clearly providing service to the country. Our earliest known Aboriginal man, Thomas Bungaleen, press-ganged into the Navy as a 14-year-old boy in retribution for his father waging a war against colonisation. Thomas and his brother Matthew were taken away from their traditional country, moved to Victoria and put in cultural institutions. Thomas kept running away, so he was press-ganged into the Navy. And an interesting picture, here's a 14-year-old boy receiving his rum ration. Blackfellas aren't allowed to drink, except if you're press-ganged into the Navy. And Jerome Locke, the first known Aboriginal man in the infantry uniform, is in the New South Wales Rifles. Working on the stations that we discussed earlier, in the transport, keeping men on the front line and giving Aboriginal men the skills and ability that weren't bestowed on them before, and equally so with our women, having opportunity to provide, to do work that was traditionally men's jobs. Our women went out and learned those skills. Involvement in the community, there are our aunties up in the Northern Territory, tanning the hides and salting the hides, being paid to do that work. The medical treatment and the top end vastly improved by the coming of the military. The coming of the military led to the Wave Hill walk-off, and which led to land rights in the Northern Territory. Because during the war, the army paid the stockmen an equal day's pay for an equal day's work. And we all know the song, From Little Things Big Things Grow, Vincent Langardi, the Gadinji people. That's about British Lord Vestey not paying rations, sugar and tea and flour. The military come along and put pound notes in your hand, then Lord Vestey wants the men to go back to being rationed. They think, nah, we got pay now, we know what we're worth. And they led to the British way, the Wave Hill walk-off. But that's because of the military up there and paid them equally and had the respect. You do a job, you get paid. Okay, that's just a side note. I get distracted. Auntie Dolly, she was again a forefront at the hygiene squad. Her work and the work of her other aunties that run the hygiene squad had the lowest rate of malaria infection for the region because she was on duty for making you wash your hands. We all know how important washing your hands is. Yeah, we just learned that in the recent pandemic. But they were getting rid of still water that was lying there. They were clearing that up so mosquitoes weren't prevalent in the camps. So it was keeping men available to fight by avoiding malaria. And the distribution of quinine too was starting to move along as well. But in the top end, very important work. Cleanliness. Cleaning the rubbish so you don't get flies and mosquitoes and bugs that bring on disease. Auntie Dolly was the leader of the hygiene squad. There were some myths. Aboriginal people didn't fight in the wars. We clearly dispel that. Aboriginal soldiers don't march on ANZAC Day. It's not true. You just don't see them because we don't march in a group. They march equally with their units and is accepted as equal, and they're part of the unit. Aboriginal men didn't get soldier settlements. That's not true. Some were rejected, but the whole basis of the soldier settlement scheme was flawed from the start. 300,000 men, 40,000 blocks. Someone's going to miss out. We do have 41 Aboriginal men received soldier settlement blocks in the First World War. But it's a case by case. We have to first investigate, did the man apply? If he didn't apply, you can't get knocked back. But was it racist based on the same rates of application? Or was it just a poorly designed scheme where promises were made to soldiers and not enough blocks? And then you got the block that's under 3 foot of water. Or they take a man with dairy farming skills and put him on a cattle station in the middle of the Northern Territory. So It was a terribly designed scheme. And Aboriginal soldiers didn't get their medals. Yes and no. That's a tricky one. Well, we've got instances where the military chased men for years trying to get them their medals. Can't find them. But you don't want to go back under the protector. Or Aboriginal men are excluded from town so they can't go and collect their medals because they're in the post office and they're not allowed in town. Case by case. But yes, Aboriginal men got their medals. No, they didn't. And for the reasons they didn't are varied as the men themselves. Any questions? Don't have to go with those ones. If you've got one from the audience, I'm happy to take them.